Donald Trump at peak over House investigations, ongoing criminal probes stemming from the Mueller investigation, and legal setbacks possibly forcing his financial records into public view. His presidency has taken on the feel of a downward spiral, with the Democratic-led investigations into his efforts to obstruct the Russia investigation increasingly leading to discussions about whether his conduct amounts to high crimes and misdemeanors. Donald Trump is clearly triggered, and Democrats appear to be wresting the upper hand from the administration on the legal battle to stonewall each and every one of the congressional probes. In now two separate rulings, judges have refused requests from the White House to stop banks and accountants from turning over financial documents to Congress, meaning we're the closest we've ever been to Trump's tax returns. And a judge in Michael Flynn's case, remember him, Donald Trump's first national security advisor? Well, a judge has ordered the public release of never-before-seen evidence, including transcripts of a voicemail from Donald Trump's one-time lawyer and the phone call that started it all, a conversation between Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak about sanctions and Mike Flynn, which Flynn later lied about to federal investigators. All of this information so far withheld by Trump's administration because they don't want Trump's records or any of the underlying evidence in Mueller's investigation turned over to Congress. And it's that evidence that could help us get to the bottom of one of the biggest questions left unanswered by Robert Mueller's report. Why so many lies about so many Russians by Donald Trump and the people close to him? And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us on set, NBC News correspondents Heidi Presbella and Carol Lee, Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press, the aforementioned Carol Lee, and Kimberly Atkins, senior correspondent for Boston public news station WBUR. Plus, former federal prosecutor Paul Butler joins us from Washington. Paul, let me start with this Mike Flynn ruling. Mike Flynn, I think a lot of people stopped paying attention to. He pleaded guilty to lying in the earliest days of the Trump administration, but he's still on our radar as people who cover this because he hasn't been sentenced yet. A judge putting out an order saying that by the end of May, and I understand that could get pushed, we'll have access to possibly a transcript and maybe even a recording of a phone call between the president's lawyer, John Dowd, and Mike Flynn, where a pardon might have been discussed, and some of that underlying collusion-y evidence of a conversation between Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak and Mike Flynn.
Yes, so this is the video version of the Mueller report. Most people haven't read those 400 pages that outline those 10 episodes of obstruction of justice, but people will tune in to a congressional hearing or they'll listen to a recording of a telephone call, especially an incriminating one like this. So just like if Mueller testifies, people will get to see on TV the guy who looks like the head prosecutor from Law and Order and has all of that credibility. It gives all of those allegations a lot more substance, a lot more weight. There's something about hearing and seeing that's different than reading. Any prosecutor knows that.
Carol, a former national security official described the Mueller report to me in terms of a roadmap for Congress as a screenplay, that he's already cast it, that all that Congress has to do is call the witnesses to read their parts. Chris Christie, who has absolutely no right to any privilege. Corey Lewandowski, who never worked in the government, was involved in that flashpoint around the unrecusal, which our friend Chuck Rosenberg says isn't even a thing to unrecuse from running the Justice Department. There are so many anecdotes that, as Paul Butler is saying, if the Democrats could just figure out how to bring them to life, to produce them for television so people can understand what was investigated and unearthed by Robert Mueller, they might have a better handle on just how far he went to try to obstruct justice.
Yeah, and that's just not what they've decided, at least for now, that their strategy is going to be. And I think it has left some Democrats, particularly ones who are outside looking in, questioning whether or not they should be taking a different tact, whether, whether it's smart to get down in the weeds with the president in terms of a whole host of other issues, and to focus so much on specifically Robert Mueller and the specific underlying evidence that backed up the Mueller report, and these kind of what some would say are in the weeds sorts of things, rather than, as you say, bring these characters to life who can far better way, if your agenda is to put pressure on the president and to try to bring to life what happened in the Mueller report. That's a far better way, in some people's view, of doing it than just, letters, subpoenas, those sorts of things that we've seen so far. And, I don't know that they'll switch tactics at this point because they seem to have a very clear path. But there certainly is increasing chatter around the edges about whether or not they should.
And they did issue subpoenas for Hope Hicks and Annie Donaldson. Annie Donaldson, not a household name, but she was the chief of staff to former White House counsel Don McGahn. She took copious notes. The Washington Post, Carol Lennick, had a neat story about how Annie Donaldson's notes could be the Nixon tapes of the Mueller report. But to Carol's point and to Paul's, this does seem to hinge around some vehicle, some tactic to bring this into people's living rooms. And the person who seems to get that is Donald Trump.
Nope.
I mean, Donald Trump's exertion of privilege seems to have as much, I doubt he's read the whole report. It seems to have as much to do with keeping that television hearing drama from coming to pass as anything.
Donald Trump knows television. He knows the power of images. He, of course, was in show business for a number of years. Even prior to that, as just a New York real estate developer, knew the usefulness of a stunt to get press attention. He knows the power of that. And yeah, your point is exactly right. I was in Vietnam with him this February, and Michael Cohen's appearance for Congress upstaged a summit with Kim Jong-un. Yeah. That was what people cared about. It was so different from just reading the words or reading a testimony. It was Cohen taking the oath, sitting in front of Congress, and delivering in his own words what the president asked him to do. Now, Cohen, of course, has quite a bit of credibility issues and is now in prison. But a Robert Mueller, who is there, doesn't have those issues. Of course, partisans on the right will paint him as someone who is leading a witch hunt to get the president. But for most Americans, he is someone who is given his life to this country, decades of service, is a veteran, and who has, and this is key, and according to our reporting, the president is on this idea as well. He hasn't spoken in 2 years. Yeah. They will be so captivating for Americans to finally hear Robert Mueller speak and go through this. And I don't think Mueller is such an institutionalist, were he to do eventually testify, I don't think people anticipate that he would set a flamethrower to the Justice Department, not at all. But I think just hearing him in a matter-of-fact way describe what his investigation found will hit home for a lot of Americans, and Donald Trump does not want that to happen.
And then there's something sort of underneath that. I mean, the subplots are around all the flashpoints in the obstruction investigation, and they play out very mob-like. Hey Chris, what do you think about Offen Mueller? And Christie's testified, and the interviews are in the footnotes. He didn't say remove, as Attorney General William Barr testified before Congress. He said fire. And Chris Christie, you have to hope, would testify truthfully before Congress. Corey Lewandowski, same thing, called him over 4th of July weekend. All the details are in the footnotes. Hey, Corey, can you tell Sessions he's out of here? He wanted to fire him Comey style. I mean, there are other characters. They may be sort of, season 2, season 3 extras, but there are other characters who, if compelled to testify before Congress, could help tell that story as well.
Completely right. They might not have quite the credibility or the star power that Robert Mueller would.
Let's hope not.
But there are people where Americans would be interested to hear their stories and hear what they have to say. And I think even if they're not outlining criminal behavior, the mob example is a good one. It's unseemly. It is it's politically embarrassing and damaging to this president, and he and the people around him are well aware of that, which is why they have adopted the tactics of literally just say no. It is stonewall up and down to try to prevent these things from happening.
In order to stage this and have it be successful and have all of the witnesses be able to speak freely, though, there has to be a baseline. And I think that this is what Nancy Pelosi is trying to establish right now. The baseline is full access to the Mueller report and Mueller himself, because we don't have some of the most basic questions answered, including why didn't you bring charges on obstruction? Answer, most likely, because you can't indict a sitting president. I left that for you, Congress, to pursue potentially through an impeachment inquiry. Right there, no matter what Mueller says, whatever other information he chooses to not discuss, you've got a big whopper that comes out right there at the top. And then you're able to draw in all of these other characters. But if they start doing that, if they start now going down that road, I think they feel that they lose their leverage and starting out with bringing in Mueller and establishing that they have every right to the full Mueller report, because it has been so distorted in terms of that by Barr, saying no collusion, no obstruction, which is the opposite of what the report says.
I want to ask you about some of the legal victories, because whenever you have some success, it emboldens the path you've charted. And for better or worse, the legal victories around some of the president's financial records, gaining access to the accounting firm, possibly the Deutsche Bank records, will likely affirm those who advocated for that strategy.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is where it has been bearing fruit. We have seen not only you have the legal cases that you talked about, the uncovered IRS internal legal memo that basically threw water on this idea that Secretary Mnuchin cannot produce these the tax returns. It says that he really has to, absent a claim of executive privilege, which the president clearly doesn't have. The tax returns from before his presidency could not possibly be privileged. You have New York State about to pass a law that will require disclosure of his state tax returns, which would match his federal ones, we would think, pretty closely. He's losing on this attempt to try to keep these documents quiet, and it's not just the Congress, it is even his own administration that is putting him on the losing side of these arguments. So I think that's one of many reasons that we have seen him increasingly agitated, increasingly combative with Democrats, is because he's not on the winning side of this.
But this is just for now, right? I mean, that's the thing about these. You can get led into a false sense of, oh, this is going to work. This is a great strategy. Or look at us, we're so successful. And they don't know. And I think the risk in not taking the more aggressive tack that you were talking about, bringing people who aren't subject to privilege and to testify and bringing life to the Mueller report, is that you're running the whole game is against time. Right. And so if you pursue the court route and you're initially winning, there's a point at which you get too far and you can't switch and do the other thing that you might have worked better.
That's a great point, because let's say they start getting the information in like July, and then you start bringing in witnesses, you're going to be right up against the election, and then Trump can turn that around on them and say, you're pursuing me for the ultimate political gain of impeachment right before my election. I think that's a good point, that you might want to consider starting things a little bit earlier to get that process started.
And to the point, Paul Butler, of how much political assistance the sitting attorney general has given this president, I hope he's pulling a salary from the reelect, because what he did in terms of branding Robert Mueller's 22-month investigation as reaching a conclusion on collusion and obstruction that was just an outright lie is such a disservice. Andy McCabe was on this show and talked about how no matter your political ideology, you should want to know why there were, what Mueller discovered, 140 contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. Here's McCabe.
I think all Americans, from wherever you stand or sit on the political spectrum, whether you supported this president or you don't, you voted for him, you didn't, put all that aside and just ask yourself, have we ever had an administration that had this volume of connections with our most considerable, most formidable adversary, and gone to such extents to cover those connections up? These are things that prompt questions in investigators' minds. We get back to that why. Why is this? Why would the president try to potentially obstruct justice and negatively impact our investigation into Russia? Why are his associates and the people around him and the people in his key positions lying about their contacts with Russians? These are very concerning questions and things that need to be investigated.
So, Paul Butler, we still don't have an answer to any of those very logical, well-reasoned whys.
Director McCabe is right that the Attorney General should want to know if he's focused on national security or the rule of law or the integrity of our electoral process. If, on the other hand, he's mainly concerned with defending Donald Trump like he's a defense attorney, then he probably doesn't want to know. And unfortunately, when we look at the Attorney General's recent actions, there's no reason to have confidence in his ability to represent the United States as opposed to the president. Just with this incident with the tax returns, the Justice Department wrote a memo that said that the Treasury Department doesn't have to turn over the tax reserves. That's in direct conflict with a memo that we now know a Treasury Department employee wrote that said that the Treasury Secretary doesn't have a choice. He must turn over those records. So this is about a career employee of the Treasury Department versus Barr's partisan political Department of Justice. As a former federal prosecutor who worked for the Department of Justice, I'm embarrassed about this Attorney General.
And I think if you go out and you unpack the damage Barr did to the actual letter of the Mueller report, it really justifies the closer scrutiny. This is what the Mueller report said on obstruction, which McKay referenced in that clip, which Paul just referenced. The Mueller report says this: the incidents of obstruction were carried out through one-on-one meetings in which the president sought to use his official power outside of usual channels. Viewing the acts collectively can help to illuminate their significance. Mueller also makes clear that perhaps Congress should be the one to determine how that should be handled with this. With respect to whether the president can be found to have obstructed justice by exercising his powers under Article 2 of the Constitution, we concluded that Congress has authority to prohibit a president's corrupt use of his authority in order to protect the integrity of the administration of justice. What's Congress waiting for? Mueller basically said, over to you.
Right. Well, he didn't anticipate the Attorney General stepping in first and making that declaration that there was no obstruction of justice that he and the Deputy Attorney General did together. There does seem to be this sense that Congress.
Yeah, let me just add that too for our viewers. So this was Barr's spin on this. I would call it a lie, but you can call it what you want. Barr said the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question. It does not. The report only sets out evidence on the side that he obstructed justice and leaves unresolved what the special counsel's views as difficult issues of law and fact are. That is also untrue. The special counsel in the section I just read says, over to you, Congress, as to whether the president's actions and intent could be viewed as obstruction. I mean, the Barr explanation on obstruction and how the special counsel left it is a lie in and of itself.
Right, and we know from reporting that Robert Mueller and his team was very unhappy with Barr's decision here to put this summary letter out there and categorize his findings that way. I mean, certainly Barr has always had an expansive view of executive power, fine, but I think that what has happened since then is surprised people who have known him for a really long time, people throughout Washington, where he used to have a pretty stellar reputation from his previous stint in this job, is just how willingly political he has become, and to the point where the president, according to what we've written, now refers to him as like, well, I finally have my Attorney General, that he's got loyalty to me, when of course his job should be to be the nation's top law enforcement officer. And this is sort of a hidden moment that we've discovered, people in the last few weeks have relayed to me, is when the president declared his national emergency at the border and was overriding Congress's veto. He had an event in the Oval Office where he explained it, and Barr stepped forward and said, sir, you have the legal justification to do this. But then he went on. He ad-libbed a line saying, and it's like to the moral imperative of the country that you do this. It's for the safety of the country that you're doing this, sir. And the president told people afterwards that Barr, that's impressed and surprised him, that Barr was willing to do that, to go out on a limb for him in a political way. And what we've seen there ever since is Barr been willing to do that time and time again to have the president's back.
Sure sign that you're failing upward. You've gone farther than Donald Trump wanted you to do in debasing the rule of law.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.